My name is Talia Monroe. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a divorce mediator. Which is ironic, I know, because if anyone knows what it feels like to live inside a fractured family, it's me. I spend my weekdays helping strangers divide homes, custody, furniture, and futures with as little bloodshed as possible. I wear soft colors, speak in calm tones, and always bring tissues. I've seen people at their worst screaming across conference tables, throwing accusations like grenades, and I've learned how to breathe through the mess. How to keep my voice steady when someone's world is caving in. It's my job to create order out of emotional chaos. But none of that training prepared me for my own family. You see, when you grow up in a house where love is rationed and loyalty is conditional, you learn to shrink yourself to keep the peace. You become skilled at pretending everything's fine, smiling at birthdays where no one remembers your favorite cake, laughing at jokes made at your expense, nodding along when people rewrite your memories like they were never yours to begin with. For most of my life, I was the good daughter, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause problems. My father, Richard Monroe, is a man who values control above all else. He raised me with rules spoken and unspoken, and I followed them like gospel. Because when he was happy, life was manageable. And when he wasn't, well, let's just say the air got heavy enough to crush your lungs. My mother, Elaine, left when I was 7. I don't blame her, not anymore. She wasn't built to survive the kind of silence my father wielded like a weapon. After the divorce, she moved to Arizona and started over. She calls sometimes, sends cards on holidays. But the emotional bond, whatever thread we once had, was quietly severed, like a string of pearls that broke and scattered across the floor. After Mom left, Dad married Margaret. Margaret was polished, refined. The kind of woman who folded napkins into swans and corrected your grammar in front of guests. She brought with her 2 children from a previous marriage, Andrew and Sophie, and, within months, our house transformed into something that looked picture-perfect on the outside but felt like a museum inside. Clean, cold, curated. I was 12 when they moved in. Too old to adapt, too young to escape. From the beginning, it was clear. I was the extra. Andrew was the golden boy, athletic, charming, a born performer. Sophie was delicate and emotional, always needing something. Margaret made sure they had everything: new clothes, private tutors, endless praise. I got polite neglect. I wasn't mistreated, exactly, I was just invisible. Birthdays became joint affairs, where my name was second on the cake. Family vacations were planned without consulting my schedule. I once overheard Margaret telling a neighbor, "We have 3 kids, well, 2.5, really. Talia mostly keeps to herself." She laughed like it was a joke, but I never forgot those words. And neither did I forget how Dad didn't correct her. Still, I tried. God, I tried. I tutored Sophie in geometry, even when she snapped at me for being too smart. I covered for Andrew when he came home drunk his senior year. I cleaned the kitchen on Thanksgiving while Margaret sipped wine and took credit for the meal. I worked hard, kept my grades high, got into college on a scholarship, paid my own way. And I never asked for anything. Not until last month. That was when I got the call that my father had suffered a stroke. It wasn't fatal, but it was serious enough that he'd need in-home care for a while. I drove down that same night, packed an overnight bag, and walked into the hospital room with my heart in my throat. He looked smaller somehow. Paler. A little more human. He smiled when he saw me. Least, I think it was a smile, and for a moment, I thought maybe things could be different. Maybe this was the crack in the wall we'd both been pretending didn't exist. Then Margaret arrived. And Andrew. And the invisible line was drawn all over again. They talked over me, around me, made decisions without asking for my input. I tried to stay calm, rational, helpful. I offered to take shifts staying with Dad at home. I even arranged to speak to his doctor about his physical therapy plan. But they made it clear without ever raising their voices that my presence was not needed. That I was, once again, the extra. Until the day of his discharge. We were all in the hallway. The nurse brought out the paperwork. Margaret was busy on a call. Andrew looked bored. No one stepped forward. So I did. I reached for the clipboard. And Andrew looked at me like I'd just pulled a fire alarm. "Don't touch that," he said. 4 words. Quiet. Controlled. The same tone Dad used when I was 8 and spilled juice on the carpet. But I wasn't 8 anymore. I looked at him. Then I picked up the pen. And I signed my father out. The tension was so thick in that hospital corridor, you could have sliced it with the corner of that clipboard. I didn't care anymore. I didn't flinch, I didn't ask permission, and I didn't look for approval because for once in my life, I was done being the girl who stood on the sidelines of her own story. I gripped the pen, scribbled my signature on the discharge papers, and handed them back to the nurse with a calm smile that probably masked the tiny earthquake happening in my chest. Andrew was still standing there, his mouth half open like he couldn't quite believe I'd done it. I didn't bother explaining myself to him. I didn't owe him or anyone an explanation for showing up for my father, for caring, for taking initiative when the people who claimed to love him had treated this entire ordeal like an inconvenience wrapped in a designer excuse. The nurse nodded and disappeared with the paperwork, and just like that, the ink on that page became a declaration. I had crossed a line. Not theirs, mine. A line I'd drawn long ago but never dared to step over. And in the eerie silence that followed, Margaret finally turned around from where she'd been fake laughing on her phone, her voice still sugary with whatever social obligation she'd been tending to. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noticed the shift in energy. "I signed the papers," I said as evenly as I could, though my heart was slamming against my ribs like it wanted to break out and run. "You what?" she asked, blinking in that slow, disbelieving way that only people who are used to having full control can manage. "Talia, those papers were supposed to be handled by Andrew." "Well," I said, folding my arms in a way that felt more defensive than powerful. "He didn't." She laughed on of those dry, breathy laughs that doesn't reach the eyes. "You're not the primary caregiver. You haven't even been around." "I'm his daughter," I said. And that, I thought, should have been enough. But it wasn't. Not for her. Not for them. Andrew stepped forward then, his voice low but loaded. "You're making this about you, as always. It's not your decision to make." "No," I said, meeting his eyes, "but someone had to make one." Margaret's face tightened in that way I remembered from childhood, the pinched lips, the flared nostrils, the barely concealed disdain. "You can't just insert yourself into his care plan like this. We already arranged for a nurse. He'll be staying with us." "Oh, I know," I said. "And I'm not trying to stop that, but nobody was stepping up." The nurse asked for a signature. I was there. I signed. End of story. But it wasn't the end. It was the spark. Because later that evening, while Dad was still groggy from medication and resting in the backseat of Margaret's car, I followed them home. I wasn't invited, of course, but I needed to see where they were taking him. Needed to make sure he wasn't just being shoved into a guest room with beige walls and a nurse who'd clock out the moment things got too real. When we pulled up to their pristine colonial-style home, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, the kind of lawn that stays green even in January, I felt a pang I hadn't expected. Not jealousy, just distance. This was the life they built together while I was learning how to microwave ramen in my 1-bedroom apartment and walking to work in the snow because I couldn't afford car repairs. Margaret helped Dad inside while Andrew busied himself with the luggage. I stayed by the door, hesitant, unwanted. But then my father, still groggy and confused, reached out and grabbed my hand. "Talia?" he murmured, his voice rough, but unmistakably tender. "You came." Something in me cracked. Just a hairline fracture. But it was real. "I'm here, Dad," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." He smiled, briefly. Then his hand slipped away and he leaned into Margaret for support. And just like that, the door closed between us again. The next morning, everything escalated. I woke up to a text from Sophie off all people. "Sophie, 7:12 a.m. Heard you made a scene yesterday." Margaret's furious. "Dad's too tired for drama. Maybe back off?" No. Good morning. No. How's he doing? Just that thinly veiled accusation wrapped in fake concern. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I had too many, and none of them felt like enough. Instead, I got dressed and drove back to the house. Margaret met me at the door like I was a solicitor. "You really shouldn't be here," she said, her eyes scanning me like I was a stain on her welcome mat. "I just want to check on him," I said. 10 minutes. She sighed dramatically, but let me in. Dad was in the living room, propped up with pillows, looking even more tired than before. A nurse was fussing with his meds. He looked up when I entered and gave a faint nod. No smile this time. "Morning, Dad," I said gently. "Talia," he mumbled. "You didn't have to come again." Margaret shot me a look. "Exactly." I ignored her. "I just wanted to bring these," I said, holding out a folder of medical resources, physical therapy recommendations, a list of support services things I'd gathered from colleagues in my network, because even if they didn't want my help, I still cared enough to offer it. Margaret didn't take the folder, just stared at it like it was offensive. "We have everything under control," she said. I looked at my father. He didn't disagree. He didn't even look at me. That hurt more than I expected. But what hurt even more was what happened that afternoon. I got a call from the rehab center where my father had been prior to the hospital. The administrator on the other end was polite, but firm. "Hi, Miss Monroe. I just wanted to follow up regarding the discharge. We've had some confusion regarding who authorized it. There's been a formal complaint submitted. Apparently, one of the family members believes the discharge was done without proper authority." My stomach dropped. "A formal complaint? Against me? They're saying you weren't on the list of approved contacts," the administrator continued. "We just need to clarify your role moving forward. Are you the legal medical proxy?" "No," I admitted. "But I am his daughter." "I understand, Miss Monroe. But we may need confirmation from Mr. Monroe's legal representative, just to clean things up on our end." I hung up, my hands trembling. So, this was it. They weren't just shutting me out. They were erasing me. It's strange how quickly you can go from being someone's child to being treated like a stranger trespassing on land you were born into. I sat in my car outside their house for nearly 20 minutes that day, staring at the front door like it might open on its own and invite me back in, not just physically, but emotionally, completely, like it used to when I was a little girl and that house still had a place for me. But the curtains were drawn. No one waved. No one even texted to ask where I'd gone after the misunderstanding with the rehab center. It was almost like I'd been scrubbed from the scene entirely, like my name had never been signed on that clipboard, like I'd never shown up at all. I had never realized how deeply it could hurt to be excluded from something you had every right to be part of, how it could feel like a paper cut on the soul so small it almost didn't deserve attention, yet deep enough to sting every time you moved. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Not after the phone call, not after hearing the word complaint in that sterile tone the rehab center used, like I was some unstable outsider trying to sneak my way into a family decision. I just drove. Drove until the houses blurred and the city became a moving mural behind my windshield. I didn't know where I was going until I ended up at the little diner near my old high school, the one where I used to meet my mom on her visitation weekends before she moved out west for good. It was the kind of place where the booths stuck to your thighs in the summer, the coffee tasted like warm regret, and the waitstaff called everyone home like it made up for the bitterness of everything else. I ordered tea I didn't want and stared at the chipped rim of my cup while the sounds of clinking silverware and low conversation surrounded me like white noise. And I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have just waited for someone to ask me to sign those papers. Maybe I should have taken the hint when Margaret didn't return my calls, when Sophie's text sounded more like a warning than a gesture of concern. Maybe being born into a family didn't entitle me to be a part of it. That thought it was like swallowing broken glass. Because I had done everything I could to be a good daughter, a decent person. I'd kept my mouth shut when Andrew got the promotion Dad helped arrange. I smiled through Sophie's bridal shower where no one introduced me as her sister, just Dad's daughter from before. I stayed out of the will conversations, the family vacation group chats, the planning committees for anniversaries and milestones that I was technically part of, but never emotionally invited into. I had always told myself that staying silent was the higher ground, that maturity meant not reacting, that kindness meant understanding where people were coming from, even when they hurt you. But now I wasn't so sure. Now it just felt like I'd trained them all to believe I didn't need anything, that I didn't care, that I was immune to being forgotten. And suddenly, I felt furious. Not the kind of anger that burns fast and loud like fireworks, but the slow, creeping kind that settles in your bones, the kind that makes your fingers curl around a coffee mug too tightly and your teeth clench when no one's looking. I was angry at Margaret for treating me like an intruder, at Andrew for always assuming authority he never earned, at Sophie for pretending I didn't exist unless I was needed to make a family photo look balanced, at Dad for letting them. Because I had been loyal. And loyal daughters don't just appear when things go well. We show up in hospitals, we read discharge instructions. We ask questions, we prepare, we sacrifice time and work and emotional bandwidth to be present even when no one thanks us for it. So why did I feel like I was being punished for caring? That night, I got another text, this time from Margaret. Margaret, 8:49 p.m. Talia, I understand you're trying to help, but it's creating confusion. We have things under control. The nurse will update you if needed. Please respect our process. No, thank you. No, we appreciate you. Just another elegant dismissal, dressed up in clinical language that made me feel like I was being removed from an email chain. I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to be polite anymore. Instead, I started drafting an email to the hospital myself, asking them to confirm exactly who had legal authority to manage my father's care, if a health proxy had been filed, if I had any standing at all. I wasn't going to keep begging for scraps of inclusion from people who would have preferred if I never showed up. But beneath the anger, there was something else, something heavier. It was the sadness. The kind that creeps in late at night when the world quiets down and there's nothing left to distract you from what's missing. Because no matter how strong I tried to be, no matter how many therapy sessions I'd sat through or how much independence I'd cultivated over the years, I was still that little girl at her father's wedding, standing next to the ice sculpture, watching him take a new family's hand without ever once looking back. I was still the one not chosen. And being excluded as an adult didn't make it hurt less. It made it hurt differently, deeper. Because now I knew exactly what was happening. And I had no excuse for pretending it was okay. There's a particular kind of ache that comes from watching people rewrite a story you lived through when they edit out your presence so convincingly that even you start to question whether you were ever really there. That's how it began to feel in the days that followed, like my history with my father was being quietly deleted one decision at a time, as if all the birthdays I'd waited by the window for him to arrive. The Father's Day cards I'd sent even when I got no reply. The garage conversations from when I was 10 and still believed I mattered were just footnotes in a book they were now authoring without me. It started with the group messages. A new family group chat was created, one I wasn't added to, and I only found out because Sophie accidentally sent a photo meant for that thread to me instead. My father sitting up in bed, smiling faintly, a tray of breakfast in front of him, with Margaret in the background fluffing his pillows and Andrew leaning casually against the doorframe like he'd just saved the day. No one responded when I asked how he was doing. No one answered when I offered to come by and help. Then the photos started appearing on social media. Harmless at first, smiling shots of family bonding time, filtered and cropped, always featuring Margaret's kids front and center, their arms around Dad like they'd been by his side from the start. I wasn't tagged in any of them. I wasn't even mentioned. Just invisible. The caption on one read, "Grateful to be surrounded by love during Dad's recovery. We've got this CDA number, family first." I stared at those words for a long time, feeling each one like a slap. We've got this. As if I wasn't standing right there on the edge, hands outstretched, heart cracked open, waiting to be let in. As if my worry, my time, my presence and any of it counted because it didn't fit their image of who belonged. But the worst came when I tried to speak with his doctor directly. I'd driven all the way across town to meet with the physical therapist Dr. Levinson, a kind woman with warm eyes who greeted me cautiously, clearly briefed already on the awkward family dynamics. I introduced myself, explaining I was Richard Monroe's daughter, and she nodded, flipping through her clipboard, then paused. "I'm sorry," she said gently, "but I was told that only Margaret and Andrew are authorized to receive his medical updates." "Authorized?" I repeated, my voice catching in my throat. She nodded. "There's a power of attorney document on file. Margaret submitted it last year. Legally, she's the one who makes healthcare decisions now." I stood there, stunned, like someone had reached into my chest and yanked something out without warning. "Last year?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes. It's been notarized and filed with the hospital. I'm afraid I can't share more than that without her consent." So that was it. They'd locked me out officially. I thanked her politely, left the clinic with my pulse hammering behind my ears, and sat in my car, numb. I didn't cry. I didn't even scream. I just stared at the steering wheel and tried to process what it meant to be cut off like that, to be legally reduced to nothing more than an outsider watching her father's life from the curb. That night, I called my friend Julione, of the few people who'd seen me cry over this family more times than I could count, and as soon as I heard her voice, the dam broke. "They filed paperwork," I whispered, barely getting the words out. "They made it legal. I have no rights." She was quiet for a second, then asked, "Did he know what he was signing?" And that was the question I couldn't answer. Because I didn't know if my father had agreed to that power of attorney with full understanding, or if Margaret had slid it across the kitchen table one day between bills and grocery lists and told him it was just a formality. Something practical, something everyone did. I didn't know if he remembered I existed when he signed it. If he even thought to include me. And not knowing, that was the part that broke me. Because it meant that even after everything, even after showing up, even after loving him in my own quiet, faithful way, he didn't trust me enough to put my name down. Or worse, he didn't think I'd ever want to be involved. In the following days, I tried again to visit. I brought soup. A new book. Photos of our trip to Yosemite from when I was 16, back when we still did things like that. Margaret met me at the door, perfectly composed, holding her glass of Merlot like a weapon she didn't need to raise. "He's resting," she said. "Maybe don't come by unannounced." I called. No one answered. "We've been busy." "I brought this for him," I said, holding out the bag, hopeful. She looked at it like it was a dead animal. "I'll make sure he gets it." But I knew she wouldn't. I knew the minute I turned around, she'd toss it in the trash, or worse, give it to Sophie and say it came from someone else. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just favoritism or thoughtlessness. This was a campaign. A slow, deliberate, polite erasure of my place in my father's life. And no one else even noticed it happening. Because Margaret did it with such grace, such skillful smiles and gracious words, that to the outside world, she looked like the perfect stepmother. The devoted wife, the gatekeeper of all things good. And I was just the bitter daughter who showed up too late, who made things complicated, who didn't know her place. But I did know my place. I just refused to stay in the corner she'd assigned me. I don't think people realize that sometimes the hardest part of being pushed out isn't the door closing, it's what comes after. The silence, the self-doubt. The hundreds of little decisions you have to make every day to keep yourself from unraveling when it would be so much easier to give in and disappear altogether. But I couldn't disappear. Not this time. Because as much as they wanted me gone, as firmly as they kept shutting me out, there was a part of me that simply refused to surrender. And maybe that part wasn't driven by love anymore, not entirely. Maybe it was pride, or pain, or the stubborn belief that I had the right to be present in my father's life, even if I had to claw my way back into it. So I began documenting everything. I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Dad, Care Log, and started keeping detailed records. Every time I called and was ignored, every message that went unanswered, the visitations denied, the medical updates I was excluded from. I took screenshots, saved voicemails, timestamped everything, not because I wanted to turn this into a war, but because I knew from my line of work that if it came to it, I would need proof. And if there was one thing my profession had taught me, it was this: the side with better documentation usually wins. I also started researching elder care laws, power of attorney guidelines, patient rights. I reached out to a colleague, Rachel, a family lawyer I'd collaborated with on a few mediation cases, and asked if she'd look over the documents filed by Margaret. She was kind, direct, and fast. "They're legitimate," she said after a quick review. "But you could still request a formal review if you have concerns about his welfare." I did. I filed a request with the county's Adult Protective Services to evaluate whether my father was being properly cared for. It wasn't a malicious move. I wasn't accusing anyone of abuse or neglect. I just needed someone neutral to look inside that house, to make sure that beneath all the curated appearances, he wasn't being manipulated, isolated, or medicated into complacency. And yes, I listed myself as a concerned adult child, because that's what I was. And as expected, that was when things really turned. The next time I tried to call the house, Margaret picked up and didn't bother with pleasantries. "You filed a report," she said flatly. "I filed a request for a welfare check," I corrected. "Do you know how humiliating that was for us?" she hissed. "A stranger knocking on our door, asking if your father is being mistreated? We've done nothing but care for him." "I believe that," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. "But I had no other way to confirm. You've kept me completely in the dark." "That's because you don't belong in this process," she snapped. And there it was, the truth, finally spoken out loud, not even wrapped in civility anymore. "You don't belong." She hung up before I could respond. But even then, I didn't stop. I couldn't. Because I knew that one day, if something happened, if my father took a turn, if things worsened, if he died without ever knowing I'd fought to stay, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. I had to try. So I started sending letters. Real ones. Handwritten, signed. I mailed them weekly. Short updates, gentle words, photos of me as a child sitting on his shoulders at the beach, letters where I told him stories from work, reminded him of memories I wasn't sure he still held. I didn't know if they were being read. Margaret could have been tossing them in the trash. But I hoped, God, I hoped. Because hope was the only thing I had left to hold on to. And then, a few weeks later, I got a text. Not from Margaret. Not from Sophie. From my father. "Dad. 10:17 a.m. Thank you for the letter. I remember that day. You were afraid of the waves but wouldn't let go of my hand. You still have that grip." It was short. Simple. But I stared at those words like they were a lifeline. My eyes blurred. My breath caught. I read it over and over until the image of his voice filled the silence I'd been drowning in for weeks. He remembered. He got the letter. And he knew I hadn't given up. That moment shifted something inside me, not because everything was fixed, not because the doors magically opened, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't the only one fighting. And so I kept going. I called the facility that handled his rehab follow-ups and offered to volunteer at their community events. I showed up to their caregiver seminars, sat quietly in the back, and took notes even when I was the only one not wearing scrubs or a name tag. I joined a local support group for adult children of aging parents and listened to story after story from people who are also grappling with grief in slow motion, watching their parents change, disappear, become versions of themselves that no longer remembered birthdays or promises or the shape of a daughter's face. I wasn't alone. And knowing that gave me just enough strength to keep pushing forward, one day at a time. Because this wasn't just about gaining access. It was about reclaiming a connection I'd spent my whole life being told I wasn't worthy of. And even if it took every ounce of energy I had, even if I was labeled the difficult one, the problem child, the one who stirred the pot, I didn't care anymore. I had spent my entire life trying not to upset the balance. But balance be damned. I wasn't going anywhere. The day of the confrontation wasn't planned. It was one of those moments that unfolded slowly, deliberately, like the final movement in a symphony you didn't realize had been building from the very first note. It started with a phone call, a simple one, from the caregiver assigned to Dad's home visits. Her name was Melissa. We'd spoken once or twice before, in passing, when I'd called to ask about resources, and she gave me nothing more than carefully guarded professionalism. But this time, her voice cracked slightly as she said, "Your father's asking for you. He keeps bringing up a letter. I thought you should know." And I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, blinking in disbelief, because those 9 words did something to me, something quiet and enormous, like a door cracking open in a house that had been locked for years. So I went. I didn't call first. I didn't ask permission. I just got in the car and drove like I had something to prove and everything to lose. When I pulled up to the house, the sky was overcast and the porch light was already flickering on in the early dusk, casting long shadows across the driveway. For a brief second, I sat there in the car with my hand on the ignition, wondering if I was about to walk into another wall. Another round of quiet hostility wrapped in pleasant smiles and sharp phrases designed to make me feel like the crazy one. But I stepped out anyway. The front door opened before I even knocked. It was Margaret. She was dressed in slate gray, her lipstick too bright for the tension in her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Not rudely, not loudly, just with that brittle edge I knew too well. It was the voice of a woman who had built her kingdom and wasn't about to let the exiled heir walk back through the gate. "I heard Dad asked for me," I said, my voice steady, careful. "He's confused. Melissa shouldn't have called you." "But she did," I replied. Margaret sighed, stepped aside, and said, 10 minutes. The house smelled like cinnamon and antiseptic. My father was in the living room, propped up with pillows again, a blanket tucked around his legs. His eyes flicked toward me as I entered, cloudy, tired, but unmistakably alert. For the first time in months, I saw something in them that looked like recognition. "Talia," he said, his voice hoarse. "You came." "Of course I did," I whispered, kneeling beside him, taking his hand in mine. He squeezed weakly. "I remember," he said. "The beach. You were scared of the waves." I smiled through the sting in my eyes. "I still don't like them." He chuckled softly, then winced, and I helped adjust his pillow. Margaret stood near the door, arms crossed, watching like I was a burglar she couldn't legally remove. And then Andrew appeared, stepping into the room with that familiar swagger, like he owned every room he walked into. "I thought we agreed she wasn't supposed to come around," he said, looking directly at Margaret. "She heard he asked for her," she replied. "Melissa called her without checking." I stood up then, slowly, but deliberately. "You don't have to talk about me like I'm not standing here." "You made this mess," Andrew said, stepping closer. "You filed reports. You interfered with his care. Do you know how much stress you've caused?" "I've caused stress?" I said, laughing, sharp and bitter. "You've kept me out of everything. You filed legal documents without telling me, shut me out of medical updates, blocked every attempt I've made to help." "You're not his caretaker," he snapped. "You weren't even around for years." "I wasn't around because I wasn't wanted," I said, my voice cracking. "Because every time I tried to come home, I was treated like a guest. Like an afterthought. But I've been here now. I've shown up. That counts for something." End quote. "Not when it creates problems," Margaret said flatly. "You've been disruptive and, frankly, manipulative." "Manipulative?" I echoed. "For sending letters? For caring?" "For forcing yourself into a situation where you're not needed," Andrew added. "Needed?" I turned to my father, still sitting quietly. "Dad, do you want me here?" He looked between us, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I was sure he'd stay silent, that he'd let them speak for him like he always did, that he'd watch me drown from the safety of the shore. But then he said, "She's my daughter." And it was so simple, so quiet. But in that moment, it felt like thunder. "She's my daughter," he repeated. "She stays." Andrew cursed under his breath and stormed out of the room. Margaret didn't move. I sat down beside my father again, trembling slightly, unsure of what would happen next, but knowing this was a crack in the armor I couldn't afford to waste. He leaned his head back, eyes fluttering closed, and I knew the moment was fleeting. But it had happened. He'd said it out loud, and they'd heard him. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed. Margaret didn't speak to me. Sophie never came down. Andrew left and didn't return. But I stayed. And when Dad opened his eyes in the middle of the night, confused and disoriented, and asked for water, I was the one who brought it. I was the one who sat at his bedside while the rest of the house slept. I was the one who stayed awake in the quiet, finally present in the place I had been fighting to stand in my entire life. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't look like silence, or distance, or even absence. It looks like being surrounded by people who know your name but not your heart, who see your face every day but never once ask if you're okay, who let you sit at the same table but never offer you a seat that truly belongs to you. And that's what it felt like in the days after my father's quiet declaration, after he told them I was his daughter and I could stay not welcomed, not embraced, but tolerated, like a wrinkle in an otherwise smooth life they didn't want to iron out. The air in the house grew thicker with every hour I stayed, every step I took down the hallway, every time I passed Margaret in the kitchen and received a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, or heard Sophie laughing softly with Andrew behind the guest room door, their conversations suddenly quieter when I walked by, like I was the topic or the problem, or both. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that what mattered was Dad and that he had asked for me, chosen me in front of them, cracked that wall of exclusion just wide enough for a sliver of light to come through. But light, no matter how bright, can't always keep you warm. He slept most of the time. His medications left him foggy, and when he was awake, he was often confused, slipping in and out of coherence like a man trying to hold onto threads that kept pulling from his fingers. And I sat there, morning to night, adjusting pillows, reading to him even when he didn't respond, writing more letters in a journal I kept just for him, in case his mind ever cleared and he wanted to know what he'd missed. It was quiet work, invisible, the kind no one thanks you for. And I did it anyway. Because I couldn't leave. Not again. Not when I'd finally clawed my way back into the smallest corner of his life. But that corner began to feel like a prison. There were no kind words, no shared meals, no acknowledgement of my effort. Margaret said nothing unless it was to correct how I folded his laundry. Sophie passed me like I was part of the furniture. Andrew returned 2 days later with an air of smug detachment and addressed me only when absolutely necessary, and always with the kind of politeness that felt like mockery. And one night, I cracked. It was nearly midnight. I hadn't slept properly in days. Dad had been restless, moaning softly in his sleep, his fever rising again. And I'd spent the last hour sponging his forehead while Margaret read some lifestyle magazine in the next room like it wasn't her husband slipping in and out of clarity just a few feet away. I went to the kitchen to get more water and found Andrew there, pouring himself a scotch, leaning against the counter like he owned the world. He looked up at me, took a slow sip, and said, "You've made your point, Talia. You can stop pretending now." I froze, my hands clenched at my sides. "What point is that?" "That you care," he said, shrugging. "You got your little moment. Dad said your name. Good for you. But let's not pretend you were ever really part of this." Something inside me twisted so sharply I thought I might actually collapse. "I am part of this," I said, my voice shaking. "I always have been." "No," he said simply, and it was the way he said it so certain, so final that gutted me. "You were the exception. The leftover. The daughter from the first life he never talks about." I stared at him, blinking through the burn behind my eyes, willing myself not to cry, not here, not in front of him, not after everything I had endured in silence. "You don't get to erase me," I whispered. "You erased yourself," he said, setting his glass down. "You left. You stopped coming around. You only came back when it made you look noble." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to shake him and ask how he could be so blind to the years I had spent holding back tears at family dinners, biting my tongue when I was passed over, smiling through exclusion just to keep the peace, but instead, I just walked back to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the silence crush me. And that was when it happened. The grief. Not just the grief of my father's decline, or of the years I'd lost hoping for love that never came, but the grief of realizing I might never get it. That this might be all there is. A strained visit. A few days of care. A moment of recognition followed by a lifetime of being shut out again. I curled into myself and wept, quietly, the way I'd learned to cry as a child, carefully, with the pillow pressed over my face, making no sound, because even my sadness had always felt like something that would inconvenience others. The kind of sobbing that feels ancient, like it was passed down in your bones, like your body knows how to mourn things your mind hasn't even begun to process. I cried for the daughter who tried so hard. For the child who waited at windows. For the woman who came back anyway. And when I was done, when the tears had drained every ounce of energy from my body, I sat there in the stillness and whispered to the empty room. I don't know how much more I can take. Because I was tired. So tired of proving, explaining, asking for space, asking to be seen. And in that moment, I wasn't angry, I was just broken. But even broken, I wasn't going to walk away. Not yet. It was the following morning, after another restless night filled with hushed footsteps and the soft hum of medical monitors, when everything shifted, when the quiet suffering I had been dragging behind me like a chain finally collided with something unexpected, something sharp and solid enough to change the direction of everything. I had gone into Dad's room early, carrying a tray with toast and tea the way Margaret usually did when she wanted the nurses to see her being nurturing. The room was quiet except for the slow rhythm of his breathing, and as I placed the tray down on the side table, I noticed a folder tucked beneath the stack of his magazines, half hidden and nearly invisible unless you were looking for something to distract yourself from crying again. I pulled it out slowly, thinking it was another discharge summary or rehab pamphlet, but the second I flipped it open, my breath caught in my throat. It was a legal file. Inside were documents I had never seen before, recent ones bearing my father's shaky signature. A draft of a revised power of attorney. A partially completed healthcare directive. And then, clipped to the top of the packet, a handwritten note in a familiar script I hadn't seen in years. To be completed when Talia returns. I want her involved. Please help me finalize this if I'm unable to finish on my own. My hands trembled as I read it again, trying to process what it meant. The ink was smudged in places, the writing uneven, but the intent was unmistakable. This wasn't old paperwork from years ago when Margaret took control. This was recent, days old, maybe. It wasn't notarized yet. It wasn't official, but it was real. It was him trying. And suddenly, everything that had been twisted up inside me, the pain, the doubt, the years of believing I didn't matter, all of it began to unravel. Because this wasn't just a piece of paper, it was proof. Proof that he had seen me, that something I'd said or written had gotten through, that he wanted me here not out of guilt or confusion, but because he trusted me. Because deep down, in whatever fragmented corners of his memory still held their shape, he knew I wasn't someone to be shut out. I sat down beside him, holding the note in my lap like it was something sacred, and when his eyes fluttered open minutes later, cloudy but awake, I showed it to him without saying a word. He stared at it, squinting, and then slowly nodded. "You meant this?" I asked, voice thick. He nodded again. "They don't know about this, do they?" He tried to speak, but only managed a faint grunt. Still, the look in his eyes said enough. He tried to act on his own, quietly, without alerting Margaret. And now I knew why she had been so territorial, so resistant, so venomous. It wasn't just about me being inconvenient. It was about her knowing that something was slipping from her grasp. And that was the moment I stopped waiting. I tucked the file into my bag, kissed my father on the forehead, and whispered, "Thank you," before walking out of the room with a purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. I didn't bother hiding the folder. Let them see. Let them know that something had changed. Margaret was in the dining room, arranging flowers like she was hosting a tea party for the Queen. Sophie sat at the table, scrolling on her phone. Andrew, across from her, looked up just in time to see me place the folder on the table with a quiet finality that immediately shifted the air in the room. "What's that?" he asked, voice already defensive. "Dad's wishes," I said simply. Margaret straightened, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" I opened the folder slowly, letting the note sit right at the top. Her gaze flicked to it, then back to me. "Where did you get that?" "In his room," I said. "Where he left it. Where he hoped someone would find it who wouldn't throw it away." "That's not valid," she snapped, stepping forward. "It's a draft." "I know," I replied. "But it's signed. And it clearly states his intent." Sophie scoffed. "It's not legal." "Not yet," I said, locking eyes with her. "But it can be. And if he wants it to be, then I will make sure it is." Margaret's face twisted, that careful composure finally cracking. "You have no idea what you're doing." I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, my voice calm but unshakable. "I'm doing what you didn't expect. I'm fighting back." And that was the truth of it. For years, I had been the quiet one, the good one, the one who took the hits and kept walking away because I didn't want to make trouble, because I thought love meant endurance and silence. But silence hadn't protected me. It had buried me. And I was done being buried. I spent the next 2 days making calls, first to Rachel, then to a legal advocate who specialized in elder care. I scheduled a visit with a notary. I contacted the doctor to confirm Dad's cognitive competency during the previous week. Every move I made quickly, quietly, but with resolve. And this time, I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for approval. When Margaret tried to block the notary's visit, I reminded her firmly that I had every right to facilitate changes my father had clearly initiated. When Andrew tried to argue, I pulled out the printed law that protected a principal's right to revise their power of attorney at any time. When Sophie rolled her eyes and muttered something about me being dramatic, I didn't even flinch. Because I had the truth in writing. And for the first time, I wasn't just holding on, I was taking control. It happened on a Friday, late in the afternoon, the kind of slow-burning day where the weight of tension builds quietly, hour by hour, until it reaches the edge of something irreversible. And I felt it from the moment I stepped into the house, the way Margaret's gaze followed me down the hallway like a warning. The way Sophie barely looked up from her laptop at the dining table. The way Andrew hovered near the stairs like he was waiting for something to explode but wasn't sure who would strike first. And I knew, even before I reached the living room where my father was resting, with his head tilted back and his breathing shallow, that they had seen the changes I had filed, the new power of attorney documents I'd managed to push through with the notary just the day before, witnessed, initialed, signed in my presence with a clear and quiet intention that left no room for interpretation. He wanted me in charge. They hadn't spoken to me since. Not a word. Not a whisper. Just long silences and the kind of stares that felt like splinters under your skin. But now, it was time. I took a breath, walked into the room, and placed the updated folder on the coffee table in front of everyone, the sound of paper hitting wood louder than I meant it to be. But maybe that was a good thing, maybe it needed to be loud, because nothing I'd ever done quietly had ever been enough for this family to hear. "Dad has made it clear," I said, calmly but without softness, "that he wants me involved in his carefully, not occasionally, not when it's convenient for everyone else. And this," I tapped the folder, "makes it official." Margaret's mouth opened before her breath did, as if the words she wanted to say were struggling to find the right mask to hide behind. "You tricked him," she said finally, her voice sharp and brittle, all pretense gone now. "No," I replied, steady. "I did what he asked. You just didn't think he still had the strength to ask." Andrew stepped forward, arms crossed, that ever-present smirk twitching at the edge of his mouth. "You took advantage of a sick man to get what you wanted. Congratulations." "What I wanted," I repeated, laughing softly, because sometimes disbelief is the only thing that can drown out rage. Do you think I wanted to fight this hard just to be part of my father's life? Do you think this has been easy? That I enjoyed sitting in that guest room for weeks being treated like a mistake you all had to tolerate? Sophie finally looked up, blinking slowly, her voice cutting in like a razor blade disguised as silk. You've always played the victim, Talia. It's exhausting. No, I said, taking a step toward her. What's exhausting is pretending to be okay with being erased. What's exhausting is watching people smile to your face while they build a world that excludes you behind your back. I didn't file those papers to play a game. I filed them because I'm his daughter, and he chose me, and that is something none of you can rewrite, no matter how many years you spent pretending otherwise. Margaret's voice dropped to a dangerous low, cold and bitter. You abandoned him for most of your adult life. Oh. I distanced myself because you made this house unlivable, I snapped. You made sure there was no room for me unless I was silent and small. I was never allowed to disagree, to have opinions, to matter. And he. I looked toward my father, who had opened his eyes now, listening, watching, his frail hands clutching the blanket with a flicker of something alert and focused. He let it happen. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving him. Ode. And then, softly, unexpectedly, his voice broke through the tension, raspy but strong enough to turn heads. I knew, he said. Everyone turned. I knew what you were doing, he said to Margaret, his voice like sandpaper, but each word deliberate. I saw the way you pushed her out. I didn't stop it, because it was easier. I thought I was protecting peace. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. But there's no peace in pretending your child doesn't exist. Margaret flinched like he'd slapped her. Richard, she began, but he held up a hand, and the room fell silent again. I signed those papers because I trust her, he said, looking at me now. Because she still came back. And just like that, the final crack split everything open. Margaret stood there, frozen, her mouth trembling like she wanted to cry but couldn't find the tears to match her fury. Andrew turned away, muttering something under his breath, and Sophie just stared at the floor like she had forgotten where she was. But I stood still, rooted to the spot, no longer afraid, no longer small, because for the first time in my entire life, my father had stood up for Minot with grand gestures or belated apologies, but with truth, spoken out loud in a room full of people who had spent years pretending that I didn't belong. And now they had to live with that truth. The next few hours passed like a storm slowly losing its wind. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic exits, just silence and the occasional shuffle of feet as everyone processed what had been said and what it meant moving forward. But I didn't need them to admit they were wrong. I didn't need their apologies, because I had something far more powerful than their approval. I had been seen. And from that moment on, I would no longer ask for permission to exist in my own story. There was no single moment of victory, no confetti falling from the ceiling, no dramatic courtroom declaration or grand, sweeping gesture of justice, but there was a quiet shift, slow at first, then undeniable, like the way winter doesn't end with a bang, but with the faintest green shoot pushing through snow. That was how it began. My father's voice, still raspy but clear, had fractured the foundation Margaret had built, and now, piece by piece, that structure was beginning to collapse under the weight of what had finally been spoken aloud. In the days that followed, Margaret stopped trying to hide her contempt, no longer bothering with polite smiles or veiled condescension. She withdrew, floating through the house with cold silences and clipped conversations, making herself a ghost in the very home she used to command like a queen. She no longer brought my father his tea, no longer sat beside him during his therapy sessions or hovered over his prescriptions like a concerned spouse. And though she never said it aloud, her message was deafening. If he wouldn't follow the script, if he dared to challenge her control, then she would let him feel the absence of her effort. But he didn't falter. He asked for me instead. He called my name when he needed water, when he couldn't find his slippers, when he wanted someone to sit beside him while he watched the same 5 minutes of a nature documentary 3 times in a row. And every time, I came up because I wanted to rub it in, Not because I was trying to prove anything anymore, but because I had spent too many years craving his attention to ignore it now that it was freely given. I became his constant. And that, more than any document or legal status, was what shifted the power dynamic in the house. The nurse began reporting directly to me. The therapist scheduled updates with me, not Margaret. Doctors began calling my phone instead of hers. And the more that happened, the more Margaret unraveled, not in loud, public ways, but in small, desperate acts. She would interrupt my conversations with the nurse, offering contradictory instructions, only to be corrected gently and told that my father had authorized me to make decisions. She began speaking sharply to Sophie, snapping at Andrew, slamming cabinets when she thought no one was looking. The pressure of being challenged, the first real challenge she'd faced in decades, was cracking her from the inside. And then, one afternoon, I caught her going through the drawer where my father kept his signed medical documents. Her hand froze when she saw me, one of the new forms half pulled from the folder, her lips parted like she'd been caught mid-crime. For a moment, neither of us moved. "What are you doing?" I asked, calm but firm. She stood slowly, smoothing her blouse with exaggerated care. "I was just organizing. These should be in a secure place." "They're exactly where he asked them to be," I said. She said nothing, just gave me that look again, the one that once could have withered me, but now felt hollow. And then she walked out of the room without another word. The next day, I sat down with my father and asked him if he'd be willing to put one final signature on record done, confirming not just that I was his new power of attorney, but that he no longer wanted Margaret to serve in any legal or medical role concerning his care. He didn't hesitate. So I filed it. And when the confirmation came through, I called a meeting. We gathered in the living room, not unlike the confrontation days earlier, except this time I held all the documents in hand, properly notarized, legally filed, undeniable. "I want to be clear," I said, scanning their faces. "This isn't about revenge. This isn't about punishing anyone. But Dad has made his wishes known, and they've now been legally upheld. From this point forward, I will be handling all decisions related to his care. Any concerns can be brought to me. If you're not comfortable with that, I understand, but this is no longer open for debate." Margaret didn't speak. Neither did Sophie. Andrew scoffed, rolled his eyes, and walked out. And just like that, the war was over, not with fanfare or applause, but with silence, with their withdrawal, with the quiet acknowledgement that the lines had been redrawn and I now stood inside the circle they had once pushed me out of. In the weeks that followed, things changed more rapidly. Margaret retreated entirely, leaving Dad's care almost exclusively to me and the professionals I hired. She still lived in the house, but she was a shadow of her former self, and though she occasionally made a passive remark about being excluded, even she seemed to realize there was no point in arguing with a man who had finally found his voice after years of silence. My father began to improve, not dramatically, but steadily. He smiled more, engaged more, told stories I hadn't heard since I was a child, small things like the time we'd gotten caught in the rain at a fair, how I'd tucked myself under his coat and called it a magic cape. I didn't cry when he said those things. Not in front of him. But every time I left the room, I let myself feel it, all of it. The love, the loss, the strange, aching victory of finally being chosen after a lifetime of wondering if I'd ever be seen. Because this was justice. Not in a courtroom, not on paper, but in the simplest, most profound way. Being there, being allowed, being wanted. And they knew it. They all knew it. Even if they never said it aloud. In the weeks that followed, the house began to change, not in loud, sweeping ways, but slowly, gradually, the way a body heals after trauma, cell by cell, moment by moment, until you suddenly realize one day that the pain you were holding has dulled into something you can live with. The atmosphere softened. The shadows that once hung heavy in every corner started to recede, not because everything had been forgiven or fixed, but because the storm had passed, and nothing could remain the same after it had cleared the air so completely. I started opening the windows again. It sounds like such a small thing, but for years, the house had been closed off, heavy with perfumes and silence and that unspoken weight that comes from too many years of performance. But I let the breeze in. I let the air shift. I filled the rooms with soft music, with light conversation, with quiet acts of care. I cooked breakfast instead of heating up packets. I read the news to Dad, even when he dozed off halfway through. I watered the plants that had been left to wilt by the windowsill. I reclaimed the space not as mine alone, but as a place where love didn't need to wear a disguise. Margaret no longer hovered. She kept her distance, moving through the house with a kind of quiet resignation, retreating into her room for hours at a time. There was no final showdown, no apology offered, but there was also no more resistance. In her silence, I sensed something more than defeat. Maybe it was regret, maybe it was grief, or maybe just the dawning realization that the control she had wrapped herself in had come at the cost of real connection. I stopped expecting anything from her. I simply coexisted with her like you might with an old photograph on the wall, no longer alive, but still a part of the architecture. Andrew left entirely. He packed a bag one evening and never said goodbye. I heard the front door close, the car engine start, and that was it. No fanfare, no confrontation. Just absence. And honestly, I was grateful. Not because I wanted him gone, but because I was tired of carrying the burden of trying to be family with people who never truly wanted me there. His departure was a relief, not a wound. It gave the house space to breathe. Sophie stayed for a while longer, lingering on the edges of things like she hadn't decided whether she wanted to keep pretending or begin facing the truth. She didn't speak much to me, but she didn't ignore me either. Once, she passed me in the hallway and paused just for a second and said, "He's better with you here." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That one sentence, spoken without bitterness, was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had ever received from her, and it was enough. And my father. He kept surprising me. Day by day, he seemed to come back to himself, like the parts of him that had shut down under the weight of age and illness and grief were slowly waking up again. He still struggled, his body weaker, his memory sometimes unreliable, but there was a clarity in his eyes now, a kind of groundedness I hadn't seen since I was a child. He began telling me stories, not just about his past, but about me, things I didn't even know he remembered. He asked about my work, about my life, about the things I had been carrying in silence for years. One afternoon, as we sat outside on the porch sipping tea, he reached over and placed his hand on mine, thin and trembling but warm, and said, "I should have fought harder for you." I looked at him, startled, and saw something there I hadn't dared hope. For remorse, yes, but also love, genuine and raw. "I didn't know how to balance everything," he continued. "I thought being quiet was the same as keeping the peace. I didn't realize I was choosing sides every time I said nothing." I know. I wanted to tell him it was okay. I wanted to let him off the hook, to assure him I'd already forgiven him. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I hadn't, not fully. And maybe that was part of healing too. Not erasing the pain, but learning to live alongside it, like a scar that no longer aches but still whispers of what came before. So I just nodded and said, "You're here now. That's what matters." And it was. In the quiet that followed, I looked around and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting to be invited into my own family. I wasn't sitting on the sidelines hoping someone would choose me. I had stepped in, taken space, planted my roots, and found that I didn't need anyone's permission to stay. I had chosen myself. And in doing so, I had created something I never thought possible, a place where I could belong without shrinking, without apologizing, without pretending to be less. I began thinking about what life could look like beyond this, beyond caregiving and court forms and quiet wars. I thought about going back to my practice, but with clearer boundaries. I thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere with a garden. I thought about writing down this story, not for revenge or recognition, but because I wanted to remember the path I had walked through the fire and out the other side. And one morning, weeks after everything had changed, I stood in the kitchen making coffee while the sun spilled across the floor, and I caught my reflection in the window, tired, yes, but whole. And I realized that I had become the version of myself I once thought I'd never get to be. Not the quiet daughter. Not the tolerated guest. But the woman who stayed. The woman who rose. The woman who healed. If you had asked me a year ago what I wanted from my family, I would have said something simple: recognition, a seat at the table, maybe even just a text on my birthday that didn't feel obligatory. I would have told you I wanted fairness, to feel like I belonged, to no longer be the outsider looking in on a life that used to be mine. But standing here now, with the dust finally settled and the noise quieted, I see that what I was really searching for wasn't just a role in their lives, it was a sense of peace in my own. Because the truth is, sometimes what we fight so hard to reclaim isn't the past, it's our place in the present, our right to take up space without asking permission, to be seen without shrinking, to be loved without having to earn it over and over again. And that's the journey I didn't know I was on all those years when I tried so hard to be quiet, agreeable, small enough to fit into the corners they'd left for me. That wasn't love, it was survival. And surviving is not the same as living. I look at my father now, not the man I used to idolize, not the man who hurt me by choosing silence over protection, but the man he is now, flawed, softened, still learning. And I love him in a way that is no longer desperate. I love him in a way that feels calm, measured, real. Because he finally saw me. Because he finally reached back. Not all stories end in reconciliation. Not all families repair. But sometimes, you get one person, one moment, one change of heart that shifts the course of everything, and that can be enough. I don't speak to Andrew anymore. Sophie sends polite messages occasionally, and I respond without bitterness but with distance. Margaret and I exist in parallel now, two women tethered by the same house, the same history, but nothing else. And I've stopped needing anything from her. The release of that weight, the ceasing of hope in places where hope has been poisoned, has been one of the greatest gifts I've given myself. This journey didn't make me someone new. It brought me back to who I've always been. A daughter who loved quietly and was overlooked loudly. A woman who learned how to raise her own voice when no one offered her a mic. A human being with deep scars and deeper resilience. There's something sacred about reclaiming yourself, about walking through the fire of rejection and coming out not untouched, but unashamed. There were moments I didn't think I'd survive. At nights I curled into myself and asked the universe why I had to keep proving my worth to people who should have known it from the start. But those moments didn't break me. They sharpened me. They carved out the parts of me that needed light. They gave me the power to write my own name on the doorframe of a house that had once shut me out. And now? Now I wake up and breathe more fully. Now I cook for my father and don't flinch when he forgets the name of the park we used to walk in, because I know that even if memory fails him, love doesn't. Now I speak kindly to the girl I used to be, the one who kept showing up, even when no one clapped, even when every entrance felt like trespassing. She deserved more. She didn't get it then. But I'm giving it to her now. So, if you're reading this, if you've ever felt like the spare part in your own family, the unchosen one, the silent satellite orbiting a world you were born from but never welcomed in, let me tell you this. Your value does not decrease because others refuse to see it. Your worth isn't measured by their acknowledgement. You do not need their invitation to belong to yourself. Fight if you must. Walk away if you have to. But don't let the story end without reclaiming your name. And when the time comes, as it did for me, take the pen. Write yourself in. You belong.